I'm Carol Shaw, Killian's mother. My son Killian discovered my biggest secret, a secret I kept for 34 years, and now he has given me permission to tell the story from his point of view. I've spent a lot of my life wondering why I don't look like my brother. Leo and I grew up in the same house, ate the same food, went to the same schools, same mother, same father, or so I believed for 34 years. Leo has Scott Shaw's broad nose, his easy grin, the kind of face that makes strangers trust him in under 30 seconds. People have always said Leo looks like Dad. They've always said it warmly, the way you do when something pleases you. Nobody ever said it about me. They'd pivot, hesitate, offer something approximate. You've got your own look, Killian, or my favorite. You take after the other side of the family. I never asked which side that was. I accepted it the way you accept things when you're a child, without interrogation, without pulling at the edges. You're given a story about who you are and where you come from, and you inhabit it, the way you inhabit a house. You don't go around tapping the walls for hollows, you just live there. I was 34 years old before I tapped, and when I did, the whole floor gave way. It was Easter weekend. I'd driven down from Dublin on the Friday afternoon, joining the slow holiday exodus out of the city, and arrived at our parents' house on Seaview Road in Milburn just before 6. Milburn is a small coastal town in County Cork, the kind of place that survives on tourism in summer and on memory the rest of the year. The cream-colored terraced house I grew up in sits 3 streets back from the seafront, and it always smells the same when I walk through the door, beeswax and old wood and something underneath both of those things that I can only describe as the smell of being known. Mum had been on a cleaning frenzy, which she always is when Leo and I come home. The house was immaculate in the specific effortful way that says, I care that you're here, and I am performing that caring through the medium of hoovering. The lamb was already in the oven. Dad was in the sitting room watching a sport he has no real interest in, which is his version of being peacefully present. Leo arrived Saturday morning from London, still slightly jet-lagged from a conference he'd attended in New York the week before, and by Sunday lunchtime we were doing the thing we always do at Seaview Road, existing in close proximity without quite touching each other's real lives. It's not that we're a cold family. We're not. But we've always communicated in a particular register, warm on the surface, careful underneath. There are rooms we don't enter. There always have been. I didn't know then that I was about to blow the door off one of them. Killian! Mum appeared in the kitchen doorway, pressing 3 library books into my hands before I'd finished my second cup of tea. Would you mind returning these? I'm already 2 weeks overdue, and I can't face Rose Fleming giving me that look again. Rose Fleming was the head librarian at Milburn's small public library, and she had been administering that look, a precise, withering combination of reproach and institutional authority to my mother since approximately 1998. Mum was constitutionally incapable of returning anything on time. It was one of her defining features. Sure, I said. I needed the air anyway. Coming home always did something slightly pressurizing to me, as though the familiar surroundings compressed something in my chest that needed more room than the house provided. The library was on Market Street, a 10-minute walk through the town centre. It was a cool April day, bright but heatless, with the particular quality of Irish spring light that makes everything look recently washed. The streets were quiet in the Sunday way. A few tourists drifting toward the seafront, a couple walking a dog, a woman with shopping bags. I had the books tucked under my arm and was walking past the row of cafes on the opposite side of the road when something stopped me. I can't explain it even now. A flicker at the edge of my peripheral vision. Some animal part of my brain registering something before the conscious part had caught up. I turned my head. Through the large plate glass window of a cafe called Steam and Bean, a man was sitting alone at a window table reading a newspaper. He was in his mid-60s, silver dark hair, cut short, a jawline that was sharp but not severe, dark eyes, or what looked like dark eyes from across the street, trained on the paper, but with a quality of stillness to them that suggested he was the kind of man who noticed things even when he appeared not to be paying attention. My body went cold from the feet up. It was like looking at a photograph of myself that someone had aged 30 years without my knowledge or consent. The bone structure was identical, the jaw, the set of the cheekbones, the slight forward angle of the head that I'd always attributed to a bad habit of leaning into conversations. I have a way of sitting still that my ex-girlfriend once described as coiled. The man through the window sat exactly the same way. I stood on the footpath long enough that a woman with a pushchair had to maneuver around me with a pointed sigh. I didn't move. I was trying to understand what I was looking at. I was trying to decide whether I was seeing what I thought I was seeing or whether the drive from Dublin had done something odd to my perception. He didn't look up from his newspaper. He had no idea I was there. I crossed the road and went into the library. Rose Fleming was behind the returns desk, radiating the quiet authority of a woman who had governed the same domain for 3 decades and had no intention of ceding it. She took the books from me with an expression that confirmed the overdue fine situation was, as my mother had feared. "Killian," she said, processing them without looking up. "Home for Easter, are you?" "I am." I set the books on the counter. "Rose, that cafe across the road, Steam and Bean, who owns it?" She looked up then, a brief assessment. "Steam and Bean, Desmond Murphy. He owns that and 4 or 5 other properties on Market Street and a fair portion of the industrial estate out past the roundabout, and I believe there's a development he's involved in out toward Bantry." She said it the way people in small towns discuss the local wealthy, a particular tone that manages to be informative, slightly resentful, and grudgingly respectful at the same time. Moved back about 4 years ago, made his money in commercial property development, Cork and Limerick primarily, very successful by all accounts. Was he from Milburn originally? He was, yes, left before your time though, late 80s, I think, before you were born. She paused, sorting the returned books into a pile. Your mother might know him, they'd have been around the same age. There was a group of them, that generation, before a lot of them moved away. Right, I said. Thanks, Rose. I walked out. I didn't go home. Instead, I stood on the pavement and looked back through the cafe window at the man named Des Murphy, who was still reading his newspaper, unhurried, and still entirely unaware that a younger version of his face was standing in the street outside watching him. I took my phone out and, feeling slightly absurd, took 3 photographs through the glass. Then I went home and said nothing to anyone. That evening I excused myself from the sitting room. Dad was still watching sport, Leo was on his phone, Mum was doing something in the kitchen, and I went upstairs to my old bedroom. It still had the same blue curtains from when I was 16. There was a shelf with books I'd left behind years ago. I sat on the narrow bed with my laptop and searched for Desmond Murphy, Milburn, County Cork. What came back was substantial. He wasn't difficult to find. There was a profile in a regional business magazine from 3 years ago, headlined "The Man Who Came Home." There was a mention in a Cork City business journal, and there was a brief interview in a property development trade publication. I also found his company website. The business magazine profile had a photograph. Des Murphy, 62 at the time of the article, standing outside a new apartment complex in Cork's Docklands, arms folded, looking directly into the camera, with an expression that I recognized with a lurch of something between recognition and nausea. It was the expression I make in photographs when I am trying not to look like I am posing. That slight compression of the jaw, that steady, slightly guarded look. I stared at the photograph for a long time. Then I searched for his age. According to the article, he was 62 3 years ago. That made him 65 now. My mother was 63. My father, Scott Shaw, the man downstairs watching sport he didn't care about, was 67. The arithmetic wasn't complicated. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark for a while, listening to the sounds of the house below me. My mother's footsteps in the kitchen, the low murmur of the television, Leo's occasional laugh at something on his phone. The sounds of a life I had inhabited for 34 years without knowing that I might have been inhabiting a version of it built on something I hadn't been told. I needed more than arithmetic. I needed facts. I drove back to Dublin the next morning. Mum looked a little wounded when I said I had to get back early. She'd planned a Monday lunch, and I felt the familiar guilt of a person leaving a place that has a claim on him. Leo raised an eyebrow. Dad said, "Drive safe, son," the way he always does. I kissed everyone, got in the car, and spent 4 hours on the motorway with my brain running a loop I couldn't interrupt. I found Martin Lyons through a colleague at my firm who'd used him during a difficult business dispute involving a former partner and some misappropriated funds. The recommendation was specific: thorough, discreet, no moralizing. His office was in a building off Pierce Street, first floor, frosted glass, a receptionist who had clearly witnessed a great deal and processed it all into a polished professional neutrality. Martin himself was in his mid-50s, compact, grey-haired, with the particular manner of a man who had spent decades listening to people say difficult things across a desk and had learned to receive them without reaction. He listened to everything I told him. He looked at the photographs I'd taken through the cafe window. He looked at the magazine profile. "You want to know whether this man is your biological father," he said. "I want to know what the facts are," I said. "I want evidence. I don't want a theory." He nodded. "A DNA comparison would give us a definitive answer. I can obtain a sample without the subject's knowledge, a discarded cup or glass from a public venue. It takes 3 to 4 weeks to process. In the meantime, I can investigate his history, his time in Melbourne, when he left and why, what his relationship with your mother was, if any." "Do all of it," I said. He named his fee. I agreed without negotiating, which I think surprised him slightly. He wrote something in a notebook and looked up at me. "One more question. If the result is positive, if this man is your father, what do you intend to do with that information?" I thought about it. "I don't know yet," I said. "That's why I need the facts first." He nodded again, slowly, and wrote something else down. "All right," he said. "I'll be in touch." The 3 weeks that followed were among the strangest of my life. On the surface, nothing changed. I went to work every day. I attended meetings, reviewed contracts, had lunch with colleagues, answered emails. I was entirely functional. Underneath, I was operating in a kind of suspended state, as though someone had paused a film on a frame just before something happened, and I was living in the pause. I called my mother twice during that period. Ordinary conversations, the garden, a neighbor's planning permission dispute, whether Leo had said anything about coming home for his birthday in June. I listened to her voice with a new and uncomfortable attention. I was listening for something I couldn't quite put my finger on, some register of concealment, some fault line in the warmth. I heard nothing. She sounded exactly as she always sounded. This didn't comfort me. People who have carried a secret for 30 years have generally learned to sound normal. I went through old photographs. I have a folder on my laptop of digitized family images going back to my early childhood. Birthday parties, school events, Christmas mornings, summer holidays. I went through them methodically. Leo and Dad, from certain angles, could be mistaken for the same person at different ages. Leo and I look like we might be distantly related. Me and Dad look like we've been placed in the same family by administrative coincidence. I'd always known this. I'd always had an explanation for it. Now I found myself looking at every photograph as though it were a document, searching for what it might mean to see differently. It was exhausting. It was also, I have to be honest, clarifying in a way that nothing else had been. Whatever the result turned out to be, I understood, in that period of waiting, that I had always known something was slightly off. I had just agreed, politely and without question, never to mention it. Martin called on a Thursday evening, 18 days after our first meeting. "I have preliminary findings," he said. "Can you come in?" I was there at 9 the following morning. He spread a folder of notes across the desk between us. He laid things out with the unhurried precision of someone delivering a legal opinion, factual, sequential, without editorializing. Des Murphy had grown up in Melbourne, the son of a hardware merchant. He'd been a bright student, gone to university in Cork, come back to Melbourne in the mid-80s, and started a small property development business with 2 partners. The business had grown quickly, perhaps too quickly. By 1988, it was in serious difficulty, over-leveraged, dependent on a deal that had fallen through. There had been a dispute with a local investor. Martin was careful about the details, but the outline was clear. By early 1989, Des' steam and bean position in Melbourne had become untenable, and he had left. The relevant detail, Martin said, is the period between 1987 and 1989. He placed a single sheet in front of me. I spoke to 3 people who were in Melbourne at that time and knew both parties. 2 of them described your mother and Des Murphy as close friends. One of them described them as a couple. her exact word. The kitchen in Milburn had been very quiet that evening. This room was very quiet now. My parents married in 1990, I said. Yes, and you were born in April 1991. I did the arithmetic again. 10 months after the wedding, 19 months after Des Murphy left Milburn. The DNA results, I said, should be back within the week. I attended a business awards evening in Cork on Tuesday. Mr. Murphy was a guest. I obtained what I needed. I thanked him and left. I walked along the Liffey for an hour before I could face going back to the office. The call came on a Monday morning at 7:15. I was already awake. I'd been awake since 5. The results are in, Martin said. It's a match, 99.97% probability of paternity. Desmond Murphy is your biological father. I sat on the edge of my bed and looked at the floor. The carpet was the same carpet I'd had in the flat for 4 years, slightly worn at the foot of the bed, familiar as anything. I looked at it and tried to orient myself inside this new information. Killian. Yes, I'm here. I heard you. Take whatever time you need before you decide what to do next. There's no urgency. Right. Yes. Thank you, Martin. I hung up and sat there for a long time. The flat was very quiet. Outside, I could hear the city starting its day, the first buses, a distant siren, someone's alarm through a shared wall, the world conducting its ordinary business. What I was sitting with was this. Somewhere in County Cork, a 65-year-old man was beginning his Monday morning without knowing that the conversation I'd just had taken place, and in a cream-coloured house in Milburn, a 63-year-old woman was making breakfast, tea, brown bread, whatever fruit was in the bowl, with a secret she'd been carrying for 3.5 decades, and in London, my brother Leo was doing whatever Leo did on Monday mornings, entirely unaware that his family had just changed shape. And the man I'd always called Dad, Scott Shaw, who had held my hand crossing roads when I was small and sat beside me at every school concert and driven me to every medical appointment and told me every time I needed to hear it that he was proud of me, that man had raised someone else's son and loved him completely and never once, not in 34 years, let the seams show. I needed to go home. I drove to Milburn that Saturday. I didn't call ahead. Mum opened the door, and the warmth that crossed her face, the instinctive, reflexive warmth of a mother seeing her child unexpectedly, made the ground feel unsteady beneath me, the way it does when you're about to do something that cannot be undone. Killian, what a lovely surprise. I didn't know you were... Is Dad home? She stopped. Something passed across her face, fast, old, and frightened. He's taken the car to Leo's. They're looking at a problem with Leo's boiler. She paused. Come in. We sat at the kitchen table. The wood is scored with decades of life. School projects, jigsaw puzzles, homework, meals, arguments, reconciliations. I know every scratch on it. I set the DNA report down between us. I set Martin's photograph, the magazine profile, Des Murphy outside the Cork Docklands development beside it. She looked at both without speaking. She didn't ask what they were. She didn't perform confusion. The absence of those responses told me something I hadn't fully admitted to myself until that moment, that she had been expecting on some level that this day would come. How long have you known? She said. Her voice was very quiet and very steady. A few months. I hired someone. She closed her eyes. When she opened them, there was something in them I had never seen there before, or perhaps had never let myself see. A layered, complicated expression that I can only describe as exhausted relief. The relief of someone who has been braced for impact for so long that the impact itself is almost a mercy. I was 24, she said. Tell me everything, I said. Not the version that protects anyone, the whole thing. She told me there were pauses, long ones, during which she looked at the table or the window or her own hands, but she told me all of it. She and Des Murphy had been together for 2 years, not casually, properly together, the way young people are when they believe they have found the thing they've been waiting for. They had talked about the future, about leaving Milburn together, about what a life might look like. She had been, she said quietly, completely in love with him. Then his business had collapsed. The details were complicated. A partnership that had soured, a local investor who had called in debts, a deal that had dissolved and taken everything with it. Des had borrowed against things he shouldn't have borrowed against. When it fell apart badly and fast, and there were people in Milburn who were very unhappy with him. There had been threats, she said, quiet ones, the kind that weren't dramatic but are understood. Des had needed to leave. He left in February of 1989. She had helped him pack. She had held him in this very kitchen. She looked at the table when she said this, and they had said goodbye in the way people say goodbye when they believe it is temporary and discover later that it was permanent. 2 weeks after he left, she discovered she was pregnant. There was no way to reach him, she said. This was 1989. He didn't have a fixed address. He'd gone to stay with a cousin somewhere in Limerick, but I didn't have a number. I tried to find him through people who knew him. Nobody could help me or nobody would. She paused. Eventually I accepted that I couldn't reach him. And then Scott, I said. Scott had always been there, she said. It wasn't evasive, just the truth, and she said it with the weight of something she'd carried for a long time. He'd loved me since we were teenagers. He knew about Des. He knew everything. When I told him I was pregnant, he didn't hesitate. He said he wanted to marry me. He said the baby was ours. She looked at me directly without deflecting. I should have tried harder to find Des, I know that. I've known it for 34 years, but I was frightened and I was alone, and Scott was offering me something solid and real, so I took it. I'm not proud of the taking, but I've never regretted the life we built. There was a long silence. Does Des know? I asked. He does now, she said. Since 4 years ago. I stared at her. What do you mean, since 4 years ago? She looked toward the hallway. That, she said carefully, is something Scott is better placed to explain than I am. Dad came home at 4 in the afternoon. He walked into the kitchen, saw my face, saw the documents on the table, and stopped in the doorway for just a moment with the particular stillness of a man who had known this moment was coming and had simply been waiting for it to arrive. He sat down and looked at me the way he always has, with a steady, unhurried attention that I understood now had never been accidental. It had always been a choice, every time. You found out, he said. I found out. All right. He folded his hands on the table. What do you need to know? Mum says Des Murphy has known he had a son for 4 years, I said. She says that's your story to tell. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, when Des Murphy came back to Milburn 4 years ago, your mother saw him in town. She came home and told me. She was shaken. She hadn't seen him in more than 30 years. She didn't know what to do. He paused. I thought about it for a few weeks. Then I drove to his office. Him, I said. The kitchen was absolutely with your wife. Still. You went to his office, I repeated. He was with a woman he loved. I introduced myself. Who he didn't know was pregnant when he left, I told him that a long time ago he'd had a relationship with a woman named Carol O'Brien, and that when he left Milburn she had been pregnant and that she'd had a son. But he didn't know. He looked at me steadily. Your mother and I have had 30 years to work through all of this, that he was a grown man. I didn't go to Des' Steam and Bean office and that I thought I went there because it was the right thing to do. You told him. I sat with that for a long moment. The words were almost impossible to assemble. What did he say? You went to the man who, when you told him. Why? He went very pale. Quiet for a moment. Dad said. When he spoke, asked if I was voice was even and unhurried. I told him I was. The way it always is. He asked what I wanted from him that matters. I told him I didn't want anything. Because you deserved to know where you came from. I said I was giving him information. The only way that could ever happen was if he knew you existed. I gave him your first name. He looked at the table. I told him you were a good man. I also told him that you lived and worked in Dublin for another 30 years. He paused again. Right. Then I shook his hand and left. You were 30 years old at that point. What he did with it was his business. And I thought, I don't know precisely how the story got out. The least I could do. My best theory looking back is that someone at the DNA laboratory spoke to someone they shouldn't have. These things happen, despite protocols, despite legal obligations. It's also possible that Des Murphy, in those first weeks when we began meeting, mentioned something to a confidant who mentioned it further. In a town like Milburn, information has a life of its own. What I know is that 6 weeks after my conversation in the Milburn kitchen, a journalist from a national news outlet emailed me at my work address. She had information, she said, suggesting that Desmond Murphy, prominent Cork-based property developer, had recently been reunited with an adult son he had not known about. She was planning to publish. She was offering me the opportunity to comment. I called Martin immediately. He was unsurprised in the way that people who work with human nature professionally are often unsurprised by the worst outcomes. He said, decide what you want to say and say it clearly. Anything you don't address, they'll fill in themselves. I gave a brief written statement confirming only that a private family matter was being handled privately and requesting that our family's privacy be respected. It made no difference. The story ran on a Wednesday. By Thursday, 2 further outlets had picked it up. By the following Monday, it had been discussed on national radio twice, and a Cork newspaper had run a profile of Des Murphy that referenced a personal revelation without specifying what it was, in the way that Irish journalism sometimes does when it wants to say everything while appearing to say nothing. The framing wasn't malicious, which in some ways made it worse. It was sympathetic, almost novelistically so. Mother's secret kept for decades, husband's extraordinary private act of grace, developer's unknown son emerges. It had every element that makes a story irresistible: love, concealment, time, a twist in the moral architecture. People couldn't stop talking about it. Leo called from London on the Thursday. He was barely coherent, not angry, just overwhelmed, tripping over himself. Why didn't you tell me? I should have been told. Killian, I should have been told. He was right. He absolutely was right. And I had no adequate answer except that I had been so consumed by my own processing that I had failed to consider that this was his story too. Not his paternity, but his family, his parents. The secret his parents had carried, the structure of the world he'd grown up in. It had changed shape for him as well, and he'd found out about it from a notification on his phone. We talked for 2 hours. We've talked more in the months since than we did in the previous 5 years combined. Sometimes a demolition is also a clearing. Mum was devastated by the exposure. She'd made a kind of private peace with what had happened, and having it stripped from her control and handed to strangers to narrate was its own specific punishment. I think, if I'm honest, part of her had been relieved when I'd confronted her, relieved that the secret was at last out of her body. But this was different. This was exposure without consent, which is different from confession. Des Murphy issued a brief, dignified statement through his solicitor. He confirmed that a private family matter was being addressed privately, expressed hope that those involved would be given space and time, and declined all interview requests. I thought this was exactly right. It impressed me. A man with less dignity might have used the moment differently. Merrill Foster, a Dublin-based divorce attorney, was quoted in one article, seemingly entirely speculatively, on the potential legal and inheritance implications of a paternity situation of this kind. I didn't engage with this, neither did anyone else in my family. The story ran for about 2 weeks before something else replaced it. News cycles are merciless in their movement. What felt like the entire world paying attention to your private life is, in the end, about 14 days, and then a silence that you have to learn how to inhabit. Des Murphy and I arranged to meet through an intermediary, a solicitor he trusted and who had no connection to my family. The venue was a hotel in Cork City, chosen for its neutrality, a place neither of us had associations with. I arrived 15 minutes early. I sat at a table in the hotel lounge with a coffee I wasn't drinking and tried to manage the extraordinary strangeness of the situation. I was about to meet a man who was my father, a man who had not known I existed for 34 years, a man whose face I had seen through a cafe window in my hometown and immediately, in my body, recognized as something that was also mine. He walked in 12 minutes later and saw me before I'd fully stood. I watched the moment he saw me from across the room before he'd had time to compose a response to it. His face did something complicated. We looked at each other across the hotel lounge the way you look at something that reorders your sense of what's possible. "Killian," he said when he'd crossed the room. "Mr. Murphy." "Des," he said. "Please." We sat while he ordered a coffee. We looked at each other again, more carefully this time, and I watched him absorb the resemblance the same way I'd been absorbing it since April, with a kind of stunned, helpless recognition that goes below the level of language. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know that's not adequate, but I need to say it first. I am sorry. For not knowing. For not being findable," he said. "I left in a state of panic and self-preservation. I was 28 and frightened, and I didn't look back because looking back would have required me to acknowledge what I was leaving." He paused. "I've thought about Carol, your mother, many times over the years. I convinced myself she was better off without me. It was a convenient thing to believe. We talked for nearly 4 hours. I asked things I'd been accumulating for months. He answered everything, not always comfortably or flatly, but honestly. He told me about the years after Milburn, the slow rebuilding, the work, the life he'd made. He'd been married, he told me, divorced in his mid-40s and no children, or so he'd believed. He told me what it had been like when Scott Shaw had walked into his office. I thought he'd come to confront me, he said. I thought, of course, after all these years, here it is, the reckoning. He shook his head. But he sat down and he told me, quietly and without drama, that I had a son, and then he shook my hand and left. He looked at me. I sat in that office for a very long time afterward. I couldn't work out what had just happened. What kind of man does that? The kind of man who raised me, I said. Des was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. I understand that now. It's been 8 months since that afternoon in the Cork Hotel. Des and I have had 6 meetings, dinners, walks, long conversations over coffee that neither of us has been particularly eager to end. We are building something that I'm genuinely unsure what to call it. Not a conventional father-son relationship, something newer and more tentative and perhaps more honest because of that. An acquaintance that carries within it the possibility of becoming more if both of us are patient with it and honest about what we don't yet know how to be to each other. He has never tried to insert himself into my family. He asks about my mother, occasionally carefully, in a way that is clearly managed so as not to cross into territory that isn't his. He seems to understand, or to have arrived at understanding, that what he and I might be to each other is a separate thing from the life that already existed, and that it is meant to add, not to replace. Leo and I had a long conversation about all of it, about 6 weeks ago at his kitchen table in London. We started at 8 in the evening, and it was past midnight when we ran out of things to say, and neither of us had eaten dinner. He was hurt for a while, still is slightly, that I had gone through the investigation without including him. I don't have a fully satisfying defense of that. What I have is an explanation. I was frightened of what I might find, and I didn't want to frighten him with a thing that might turn out to be nothing. That's not good enough, and I told him so. We're all right now. We've always been all right eventually. My mother and I went through a genuinely difficult period. There were things I needed to say to her that weren't kind, not cruel, but not kind, and there were things she needed to explain to me, not about the facts, which I had, but about herself, about who she'd been at 24 and what choices look like when you're frightened and young and the world has narrowed to a single corridor. We worked through it because we both made a choice to do the work of being in each other's lives. She's still my mother and I'm still her son. The rest of it is context. And then there's my father. I went to find him on his own about 2 months ago. A Sunday morning, Milburn, the seafront walk we've been taking together since I was old enough to walk at a pace that kept up with him. The sea was flat and grey and the town was quiet. We walked for about 40 minutes without saying anything particularly significant, the comfortable silence of 2 people who have been talking to each other for 34 years and don't need to fill the space. And then I told him what I'd been trying for months to find the right words for. I told him that knowing the truth, knowing all of it, knowing Des's name and face and history hadn't changed what was true. That whatever Des Murphy was to me, or might become to me, the word I had for the man walking beside me was the only word I had ever had, and the only word I intended to use. That Scott Shaw had been my father every day of my life, and would be my father every day that followed, and that I didn't experience these things as contradictions. He walked for a moment. Then he said, I know, son. 3 words. 34 years of love compressed into 3 words, offered without ceremony, on a grey Sunday morning in a small Irish town, by a man who had never once needed me to tell him, but received it with a grace that made me ashamed it had taken me this long to say. I keep coming back to the same thing, to Scott Shaw driving to Des's office uninvited, unasked, with nothing to gain and considerable psychological difficulty to navigate, and sitting down across from the man and telling him, you have a son, giving away the one piece of information he had every reason to hold on to for his own protection, doing it because he decided quietly and privately that it was right. That isn't what people do when they're afraid. It's not what people do when they're angry or resentful or protecting their territory. That is what people do when they love someone enough to give them the truth, even when the truth is complicated, even when the truth has other people in it, and even when the truth might change everything. I think about all the ways this story could have gone differently. I think about all the houses it could have burned down. What it took instead was one man's refusal to let his love be smaller than the situation required. We spend a lot of time in this world measuring people by the accidents of biology, by blood type and resemblance, and the particular arrangement of chromosomes that links us to one person rather than another. And those things matter. I am not standing here telling you that genetics are meaningless. They're not. They're part of what I am. And learning them has been one of the most disorienting and ultimately grounding experiences of my life. But biology is the opening chapter. It isn't the book. The book is written daily in the small and unsexy choices that most people never witness and no one celebrates. The school runs, the phone call on a bad day, the hand on the shoulder when you don't have words, the walk along the seafront when you need to say something and don't know how to begin, and the drive to a man's office to tell him something that cost you everything to say. If you're out there right now carrying a question about where you come from, a silence in your family that has always felt slightly too deliberate, a difference you've been taught not to name, I want to say this to you. You are allowed to know. You're allowed to ask. The truth may be more complicated than you expected, and the people it involves may be more complicated than you expected, and you yourself may turn out to be more complicated than you expected, but you're allowed to know. And I'll tell you something else. The person who raised you, whoever that is, whatever that looks like for you, that person chose you every single day. Biology happened once. They chose you every morning after that. Don't let the noise drown that out. If something in this story landed somewhere real for you, if you've ever sat with that question about where you came from, or watched someone you love carry a secret for longer than any person should, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me your story or tell me what this one brought up. We're all carrying something. You don't have to carry it in silence. I'm Carol Shaw, and this is my son's story. Welcome to Story Junkie. Subscribe so you don't miss what's next, because there's always another story worth telling.